Who are you? Stop and think about that for a moment. You probably have an answer ready. I'm an introvert. I'm a creative person. I'm someone who struggles with anxiety. I'm ambitious. I'm loyal. I'm damaged. Whatever your answer is, I'm here to tell you something that will either liberate you or terrify you. That identity you just described, that story you tell yourself about who you are, it is a prison. And every day you reinforce that identity, you're building thicker walls around a smaller cell. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this over a century ago, and what he discovered will completely destroy everything you think you know about yourself. If you're ready to break free from the person you think you are, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that like button. We expose the psychological cages that keep you trapped. Let's begin. Let me start with Nietzsche's most paradoxical statement. He said, "Become who you are." Read that again. Become who you are. Not discover who you are, not accept who you are, not be yourself, become, which implies you're not yet what you are, which implies you're in a constant state of transformation, which implies there is no fixed you to discover or be. This isn't word games. This is Nietzsche telling you that the entire concept of a static identity is a lie. You're not a thing. You're not a fixed essence. You're not a soul that can be discovered. You're a process, a becoming, a constant transformation. And the moment you stop transforming, the moment you decide this is who I am, you die psychologically. You become a corpse pretending to be alive. Now, most people hear this and think it sounds abstract, philosophical, disconnected from real life. But it is the most practical thing you'll ever understand. Because right now, at this very moment, you're trapped inside an identity that you constructed years ago, maybe decades ago, and you're defending that identity against all evidence that you've changed. You're fighting to remain consistent with a story about yourself that might not even be true anymore, and that fight is destroying you. Let me show you how this works. Think about the last time someone accused you of being inconsistent. Maybe you said one thing and did another. Maybe you changed your mind about something important. Maybe you acted in a way that contradicted your self-image. What did you feel? Probably shame, guilt, cognitive dissonance, like you'd betrayed yourself, like you were being fake or hypocritical. But why? Why is inconsistency bad? Why is changing your mind seen as weakness? Why is contradicting yourself treated as a character flaw? I'll tell you why. Because you've been taught that identity equals consistency, that having a strong sense of self means being predictable, reliable, the same person today that you were yesterday and will be tomorrow. But that is not strength. That is rigidity. That is death. Nietzsche watched people torture themselves trying to maintain consistent identities. He watched them deny their own evolution, their own contradictions, their own complexity, all in service of appearing coherent. And he realized this was a form of psychological violence. You're forcing yourself into a shape that might have fit you years ago, but doesn't fit you now. And rather than acknowledge you've changed, rather than allow yourself to transform, you squeeze yourself back into that old shape. You police yourself. You say things like, "That is not who I am. I'm not that kind of person. I would never do that." And every time you say those words, you're building your prison. Because what you're really saying is, I refuse to become anything other than what I've already decided I am. I refuse to evolve. I refuse to transform. I refuse to allow myself to be anything new. That refusal is what Nietzsche called resentment. It is the poisonous attitude of someone who says no to life, no to change, no to becoming, in favor of remaining frozen in a comfortable, predictable, dead identity. Let me give you a concrete example. You probably know someone, maybe it is even you, who constantly says, "I'm just not good at that. I'm not a math person. I'm not athletic. I'm not creative. I'm not social. I'm not disciplined." Whatever it is, they've decided it is not part of their identity, and therefore they can't do it. But notice what is happening. They're not saying, "I haven't developed that skill yet." They're not saying, "I haven't practiced that enough." They're saying, "That is not who I am." They're treating their identity as if it is a fixed set of attributes that can't be changed. And because they believe that, it becomes true. Not because it is actually true, but because they won't allow themselves to contradict their self-concept. This is the trap. Your identity doesn't describe you. It limits you. Every time you say, "I am X," you're saying, "I am not Y." Every time you claim an identity, you're closing doors, eliminating possibilities, restricting your own potential. And you think you're being authentic. You think you're being true to yourself. But you're actually being true to a story you made up about yourself, probably years ago, that might have nothing to do with who you could become if you stopped defending it. Now here's where it gets really dark. Your identity isn't even yours. It was given to you by your family, your culture, your society, your experiences, your traumas. You didn't choose most of the core beliefs you have about yourself. They were installed in childhood by people who had their own agendas, their own limitations, their own issues. Your parents told you who you were, your teachers told you who you were, your peers told you who you were. And you internalized those messages and started repeating them as if they were objective truths about your nature. But they weren't truths. They were interpretations, perspectives, stories that other people projected onto you, and you accepted because you were too young to question them. And now, decades later, you're still living inside those stories, still defending an identity that was constructed by other people to serve their needs, not yours. This is what Nietzsche meant by slave morality. You've enslaved yourself to an identity that was created by external forces, and you're now policing yourself to maintain it. You're both prisoner and guard, and you think this is freedom, you think this is authenticity, but it is the opposite. Let's talk about what identity actually is. Strip away all the philosophical language and look at the mechanism. Identity is a collection of patterns, behavioral patterns, thought patterns, emotional patterns. You've repeated certain behaviors, thoughts, and emotions enough times that they've become habitual, automatic, unconscious, and then you observe your own patterns and conclude, this is who I am. But that is backwards. You're not behaving a certain way because that is who you are. You think that is who you are because that is how you've been behaving. The behavior came first. The identity is just your interpretation of the pattern. And here is the crucial part. Patterns can change. If you change your behaviors, your thoughts, your emotional responses, your identity changes automatically. But most people never realize this because they think identity is the cause of behavior, when it is actually the effect. They think I can't do that because that is not who I am. When the truth is, you're not doing that. Therefore, you've concluded that is not who you are. If you started doing it, your identity would shift to accommodate the new pattern. This is why Nietzsche said, become who you are. Because you become who you are through action, through doing things that contradict your current self, concept, through breaking your own patterns, through allowing yourself to be inconsistent, contradictory, unpredictable, new. But here is the resistance you'll feel. The moment you try to act outside your identity, something inside you screams. It feels wrong, fake, inauthentic, like you're betraying yourself, and that feeling is so strong that most people immediately stop and retreat back into their familiar patterns. But that feeling isn't intuition. It is not your true self trying to protect you. It is your ego defending itself, because your ego is your identity, and your ego's job is to maintain consistency, coherence, continuity, to keep you being the same person you were yesterday, even if that person is miserable, even if that person is limited, even if that person is a construction that no longer serves you. Your ego doesn't care if you're happy, it cares if you're consistent, and it will sabotage any attempt you make to evolve beyond your current identity. This is the internal war Nietzsche talked about, the war between who you've been and who you could become, between your past self and your potential self, between your constructed identity and your actual capacity for transformation. And most people lose this war because they mistake the ego's resistance for authenticity. They think if it feels wrong to act differently, then acting differently must be fake. But it is the opposite. What feels natural is just familiar. What feels authentic is just habitual. And what feels like your true self is just the self you've been repeating for so long that you've forgotten it was ever a choice. Let me tell you about the most dangerous phrase in the English language. It is not what you think. It is this. That is just who I am. Think about how often you hear this, from yourself, from others. Someone points out a flaw, a limitation, a destructive pattern, and the response is, that is just who I am. As if that settles it, as if identity is a valid excuse for refusing to change. But what they're really saying is, I've been this way for so long that I've decided it is permanent. I've repeated this pattern so many times that I've concluded it is my nature. And I'm not willing to do the uncomfortable work of breaking the pattern because I've built my entire sense of self around it. That is not acceptance. That is resignation. That is giving up. That is choosing the comfort of consistency over the challenge of transformation. And it is marketed as authenticity, as self-love, as acceptance. But Nietzsche would call it exactly what it is, weakness disguised as virtue. Now, you might be thinking, but don't we need some sense of self? Don't we need some stability, some core values, some consistent traits? Isn't complete fluidity just chaos? And this is where most people misunderstand Nietzsche. He is not saying you should be chaotic. He is not saying you should have no values. He is not saying you should be a completely different person every day. What he is saying is that you should create your values consciously, not inherit them unconsciously. You should choose who you become, not discover who you supposedly are. You should be the author of your identity, not the character in someone else's story. This is the difference between construction and discovery, between creation and revelation, between becoming and being. Most people think identity is something you find, like it is buried inside you waiting to be uncovered, like your job is to dig through layers of conditioning and trauma until you reach your authentic core. But Nietzsche is saying there is no core, there is no authentic self waiting to be discovered. There is only the self you're creating right now through your choices, your actions, your interpretations. And if you don't like the self you've created, you can destroy it and create a new one. That is not being fake, that is being powerful. Let's talk about what this looks like practically. Most people have an origin story, some experience, usually painful, from their past that they've decided explains who they are. Maybe they were betrayed, so now they're someone who has trust issues. Maybe they were rejected, so now they're someone who fears abandonment. Maybe they failed, so now they're someone who doesn't take risks. Maybe they were hurt, so now they're someone who keeps people at a distance, and they tell this story over and over, to themselves, to others. They make it the foundation of their identity, and every time they tell it, they reinforce it. They make it more real, more solid, more unchangeable. But here is what Nietzsche understood. That story is just one interpretation of your past. It is not the truth about what happened. It is not an objective fact about who you are. It is a narrative you constructed to make sense of pain, and narratives can be rewritten. The same events can be interpreted completely differently. The betrayal that supposedly made you unable to trust could be reinterpreted as the experience that taught you discernment. The rejection that supposedly made you fear abandonment could be reinterpreted as the experience that taught you independence. The failure that supposedly made you risk-averse could be reinterpreted as the experience that taught you wisdom. Same events, different story, different identity, and which story is true? Neither, both. It doesn't matter. What matters is which story gives you power and which story limits you. Because your past doesn't determine your identity, your interpretation of your past determines your identity, and interpretation is always a choice. This is what Nietzsche meant by the will to power. It is not about dominating others. It is about taking power over your own narrative, over your own interpretation, over your own identity. It is about refusing to be a victim of your past, your circumstances, your conditioning. It is about claiming authorship of your own story. And most people never do this because they think their story is finding them, not them writing it. They think they're discovering who they really are when they're actually just accepting the interpretation that was handed to them by their experiences. But you're not your experiences. You're not your trauma. You're not your history. You're the interpreter of your experiences, and you can interpret them any way you choose. You can make them mean anything. You can construct any identity from the same raw material. This is the power Nietzsche is offering you, the power to destroy who you've been and become who you choose. Not who you are, not who you're supposed to be, not who your authentic self really is deep down, but who you choose right now, in this moment, based on who you want to become. Now, let's talk about why this is so threatening to society. Because if people really understood this, if people really internalized that identity is constructed not discovered, chosen not found, fluid not fixed, the entire social order would collapse. Think about it. Society needs you to have a stable, predictable identity. Your employer needs you to show up consistently as the same worker. Your family needs you to remain in your assigned role. Your community needs you to stay in your social position. The government needs you to be a predictable, controllable citizen. And all of these systems depend on you believing that your identity is real, fixed, and unchangeable. Because if you knew you could be anyone, do anything, transform at will, you'd be ungovernable. You wouldn't accept limitations based on who you supposedly are. You wouldn't stay in boxes that don't serve you. You wouldn't play roles that were assigned to you by others. You'd be dangerous not to other people, but to systems that depend on your predictability. And that is why authenticity is sold to you as a virtue, why finding yourself is treated as a spiritual quest, why being true to who you are is considered the highest form of integrity, because it keeps you locked in place. It makes you police yourself. It makes you reject any possibility of transformation as fake or inauthentic. It is the perfect prison because you're the one building it. You're the one defending it. You're the one punishing yourself whenever you try to escape it. Nietzsche saw through this completely. He called it the herd mentality. The herd needs every animal to stay in formation, to be predictable, to fulfill their assigned role. And the way the herd enforces this isn't through external force. It is through identity. By convincing you that you have a true nature that must be expressed. that you have an authentic self that must be honored, that you have a core identity that must be protected. And once you believe this, once you internalize the idea that your identity is real and must be maintained, you'll limit yourself more effectively than any external authority ever could. You'll say no to opportunities because that is not who I am. You'll avoid challenges because I'm not that kind of person. You'll stay in situations that harm you because changing would mean being inconsistent with your self-image. And all the while, you'll think you're being authentic. You'll think you're being true to yourself, but you're actually being obedient to a system that benefits from your self-imposed limitations. Let me give you a perfect example of this. Think about career choices. Most people choose careers based on identity. I'm a creative person, so I should do something artistic. I'm analytical, so I should do something technical. I'm a helper, so I should do something in service. And they never question whether those identities are real or useful, or whether they're just limiting their options. They treat their identity as a fact about themselves that determines what they can and can't do. But imagine if you approached career choice differently. Not asking what career fits who I am, but asking what career would I like to become good at? What career would force me to develop in ways I haven't yet? What career would make me into someone I'm not currently? Suddenly, you have infinite possibilities instead of the narrow range your current identity permits. But most people will never do this because it feels inauthentic. It feels like betraying yourself, like pretending to be something you're not. But what you're not is just what you haven't become yet. And what you haven't become yet is an infinite field of possibility that your identity is excluding. Every I am statement is simultaneously an I am not statement, and the I am not is always larger than the I am, which means your identity is always smaller than your potential, always more limited than what you could become, always a cage, no matter how comfortable you've made it. Now, here is the deepest cut. The most defended identity, the one people cling to most desperately, is usually the one that is causing them the most suffering. The person who identifies as someone with anxiety will defend that identity even though it makes them miserable. The person who identifies as damaged will protect that identity even though it prevents healing. The person who identifies as a victim will maintain that identity even though it strips them of power. Why? Because as painful as these identities are, they're familiar, they're coherent. They explain your life. They give you a story that makes sense. And humans would rather have a painful story that makes sense than face the terrifying possibility that there is no story, that you're not damaged, you just learned certain patterns, that you're not anxious, you just developed certain habits, that you're not a victim, you just interpreted your experiences in a way that removed your agency. Because if those identities aren't real, if they're just interpretations you can change, then you're responsible. You can't blame your nature. You can't say, that is just who I am. You have to admit, you're choosing to remain in that identity because it serves some purpose. Maybe it gets you sympathy. Maybe it excuses your failures. Maybe it protects you from taking risks. Maybe it gives you a sense of specialness. Whatever the purpose, giving up the identity means giving up what it provides, and that is terrifying. So people hold on to identities that hurt them. They defend limitations as if they're truth. They treat self-imposed cages as if they're unchangeable facts of nature, and they call this authenticity. Nietzsche had a metaphor for this. He talked about the camel, the lion, and the child. The camel is someone who takes on identities and values from external authorities, who accepts what they're told about who they are and what they should be, who carries the weight of social expectations without question. Most people are camels their entire lives, but some people transform into lions. The lion says no. The lion rejects external definitions. The lion destroys old identities and values. The lion creates space by tearing down what was built by others. This is the stage most people never reach because it is too uncomfortable, too destabilizing, too lonely, but some do. And those who do then face a choice. They can stay lions forever, endlessly destroying, endlessly rejecting, endlessly saying no, or they can transform again into children. The child doesn't destroy anymore. The child creates. The child plays. The child experiments. The child becomes without needing to defend any particular identity. The child is pure becoming without the weight of being. This is what Nietzsche called the Übermensch. Not someone with a perfected identity, not someone who has found their true self, but someone who has transcended the entire game of identity, who is free to become anything because they're not attached to being anything, who can put on and take off identities like clothes, because they they understand none of them are real. None of them are them. They're all just temporary constructions, useful tools, masks worn for specific purposes and discarded when no longer needed. But most people never reach this stage because they mistake the mask for the face. They wear an identity so long they forget they put it on. They become so identified with their role that they can't remember there is an actor underneath. And the tragedy is they think this is depth. They think this is knowing themselves. They think this is authenticity. But it is the opposite. It is being so lost in a character that you've forgotten you're acting. So trapped in a story that you've forgotten you're telling it. So imprisoned by an identity that you've forgotten you built the prison. And Nietzsche is screaming at you to wake up, to remember, to see that everything you think you are is something you constructed, and anything that was constructed can be destroyed. And anything that can be destroyed can be rebuilt differently. You're not discovering yourself, you're creating yourself, and you've been creating yourself all along. You just didn't realize you were doing it. So you created unconsciously, reactively, based on what others told you, based on your wounds, based on your fears, based on your need for acceptance and safety and predictability. But now that you know, now that you see the mechanism, you can create consciously, deliberately, based on who you want to become, based on what serves your growth, based on your will to power instead of your will to remain comfortable. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice, because this isn't just philosophy. This is psychological warfare. This is how you break free from the matrix of identity that has been controlling you your entire life. First, you have to start noticing your I am statements. Every time you say I am or I'm not, you're reinforcing your identity cage. Start catching yourself. Write them down if you have to. Notice how many times per day you define yourself. How many times you limit yourself with identity claims. How many times you defend your current patterns by calling them who you are. Just noticing is the first step, because you can't change what you don't see. And most people never see how constantly they're narrating themselves into a fixed identity. Second, start questioning your origin stories. Those foundational experiences you think made you who you are. Ask yourself, is this the only way to interpret what happened? Could I tell this story differently? Could I make it mean something else? Could I extract a different lesson? Could I construct a different identity from the same raw material? You don't have to change your interpretation yet. Just see that interpretation is happening. That your past doesn't mean anything until you make it mean something, and you're the one making it mean what it currently means. Third, start experimenting with inconsistency. Do something that contradicts your self-image, not something harmful, just something that doesn't fit your identity. If you're someone who is not creative, make something. If you're someone who is not social, start a conversation with a stranger. If you're someone who is not athletic, move your body in a new way. And when you feel that resistance, that voice saying, this isn't me, this isn't authentic, recognize it for what it is. Your ego defending itself, your identity trying to maintain consistency, and do it anyway. Not because being inconsistent is the goal, but because you need to experience that your identity is not a fact about you, it is a habit, and habits can be broken. Fourth, start asking, who would I need to become, instead of who am I? Stop looking backward at your patterns to define yourself. Start looking forward at your possibilities. Stop trying to be consistent with who you've been. Start trying to become who you want to be. And here is the key. You don't need permission from your current identity to become something new. You don't need it to make sense. You don't need a coherent narrative. You don't need to explain how the new you relates to the old you. You can just decide right now, in this moment, I'm going to become something different, and then take one action aligned with that decision. Not a huge action, just one small step outside your identity, and then another, and another, and another, and watch how your sense of self starts to shift. Not because you discovered your true self, but because you're creating a new self through action, through becoming, through the only method that actually works, doing things that contradict who you think you are, until you think you are the person who does those things. This is the secret. Identity follows action, not the other way around. You don't act based on who you are. You become based on how you act. And once you understand this, once you really internalize it, you're free, because you're no longer imprisoned by your past, by your patterns, by your story, by your identity. You can be anyone, do anything, become whatever you choose, not because you found your authentic self, but because you realized there is no authentic self to find. There is only the self you're creating right now, in every moment, through every choice, through every action, through every interpretation. You are becoming, always becoming, never being. And that is not a problem to solve. That is not a wound to heal. That is not a cage to accept. That is freedom. That is power. That is what Nietzsche was pointing at when he said, become who you are. Not discover who you are, not accept who you are, not be who you are, become. Constantly, endlessly, without arrival, without completion, without a final form. Because the moment you decide this is who I am, this is my complete and final form, you stop becoming, you start being, and being is death. Becoming is life, and you get to choose. Every single day, every single moment, you get to choose whether you're going to defend the identity you've already built or destroy it and build something new, whether you're going to remain consistent with your past or become something your past could never predict, whether you're going to be or become. And most people choose being, choose consistency, choose comfort, choose the cage they've decorated so beautifully, they've forgotten it is a cage. But you don't have to. You can choose becoming, choose transformation, choose the terrifying freedom of having no fixed identity to defend, of being pure potential, pure possibility, pure will to power. That is what Nietzsche offers. Not a new identity to replace your old one, but freedom from identity itself, freedom to become forever, without end, without arrival, without ever settling into a final answer to the question, who am I? Because the answer is always, I am becoming, and that becoming is yours to direct, yours to create, yours to author. So stop defending who you are, stop protecting your identity, stop trying to be consistent, stop treating your past as if it determines your future, stop telling the same stories, stop accepting the same limitations, stop living inside the cage of I am, destroy who you are, and become. That is the message, that is the truth, that is what they don't want you to know, because if you knew it, you'd stop being controllable, you'd stop being predictable, you'd stop being manageable, and you'd start being dangerous. Dangerous to systems that depend on your fixed identity, dangerous to people who need you to stay in your assigned role, dangerous to the entire social order that is built on the lie that identity is real, fixed, and unchangeable. So they sell you authenticity, they sell you self-discovery, they sell you being true to who you are. And you buy it because it feels safer than admitting you could be anyone, that you're not discovering yourself, you're creating yourself, that there is no core to protect, just infinite possibilities to explore. And that is terrifying, but it is also liberating, because once you accept it, once you really accept that identity is a construction, not a discovery, you're free, free to become anything, free to destroy who you've been, free to create who you'll become, free from the prison of authenticity, free from the cage of I am, free to answer the question, who are you, with the only honest answer, I don't know yet. I'm still becoming, and that becoming is the only truth about you that will ever matter. Everything else is a story, and stories can be rewritten. So rewrite yours, destroy who you are, and become.